Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to the 21st Policy Dialogue of the Education Forum Sri Lanka. On behalf of my colleague, Dr. Tara Dimel, on behalf of Dr. Tara Dimel, I welcome you all to the EFSL or Education Forum Sri Lanka, this webinar. Today's topic is meeting the demand for higher education, lessons from Australia, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. This is, before going to the topic, I should say something. The EFSL. EFSL is a platform that brings together stakeholders for conversations and for analysis in order to influence, catalyze policy reforms. And we have been doing 20 webinars. We did 20 seminars and we took a bit of a break between 20th and 21st. We thought we covered just about everything and we're focusing on advocacy, but we find that higher education is an area we really need to put more attention to, especially in light of the fact that there is an ongoing select committee in Parliament addressing the issue of expanding higher education opportunities in Sri Lanka. The topic, I think I can understand it. We can understand it from the perspective of parliamentarians who are looking at constituencies, because there is a social demand for higher education. Everybody wants their child to have a degree, and but whether that demand, we felt, that social demand is what parliamentarians are responding to. We felt we should have a little more balanced, nuanced approach at it. Taking into consideration other demands like the workforce demands, the demands in the workplace, and also other competing demands on policymakers, on the state, in other sectors like health, and especially in Sri Lanka at this time of a deep economic crisis, giving relief to people and also to industries, to small businesses. And also within education, how much weight do we put into school education and relative to higher education? So those competing demands are also there. So we are not going to address all those questions. Today, we are here to listen and learn from experiences in other countries, especially Australia, where we heard about the HECS program, Higher Education Contribution Scheme, and then the HELP program, and all the good things that Australia is supposed to be doing, and we read it on Wikipedia, but we really needed some more in-depth information. In that regard, I'm grateful to Professor Andrew Norton for agreeing to a request, a plea, actually it was a plea from a stranger, from unknown organization, but he kindly accepted, and thank you for that, Professor Norton. He is a professor in the practice of higher education at the Australian National University, and Professor Biswajit, Chanda, and I think he also, that's the first time I spoke to him. He's a member of the UGC of Bangladesh, and I'm grateful to him for accepting. And of course, Professor Sampath Amaratunge, the chairman of our own UGC. Thank you very much, all three of you gentlemen. I'm not going to do introductions. I think your titles, designations say it all. So without taking much time, but before that, I need one more entity to acknowledge. It is Advocata, which is a think tank of international repute situated in Sri Lanka, and they kindly helped us, working with us to organize this event. And the objective is to produce, of course, publicize these discussions as much as possible through all our media, and then also to produce possibly a policy brief to present to our sectoral, our select committee in Parliament. We have a sectoral oversight committee for education, and we have Minister for Education, and of course also we have a cabinet subcommittee appointed recently, which is presided by the president, which is chaired by the president himself, for major reforms in education. And I'm sure these discussions, what we learn here is going to be extremely useful coming from, people who are on the field, who are, as like Professor Norton, who's deeply studied subject. So I'm again extremely grateful to all of them. And I think we can right now go to the speakers. The plan is the speakers will do their presentations, Professor Norton for about 25 to 30 minutes, which is essentially doing a keynote. And then Professor Biswajit and Professor Amaratunge will sort of contextualize to the South Asian situation, telling us about what in each country, and possibly, if they feel like it, respond to Professor Norton's some of the ideas that we find being implemented in Australia. And then we finish that in 1 hour, and then we will go to question and answer, where people raise their hands, and we take the questions in the order they're received. Professor Norton, please go ahead and start sharing, and we can start the webinar.
Thank you for inviting me to speak, and I'm looking forward to learning about the situation in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh as well. So I'm going to talk about Australia, in particular reference to income contingent loans, the HEC scheme that Sujata referred to, which is probably the most distinctive aspect historically of Australia's system. Just give you a brief history of Australian university higher education fees. We've had universities since the mid-19th century. Generally, they were set by universities at fairly low rates initially. Then we had a period in the 1970s and 1980s when higher education was free. Then in 1989, we introduced the world's first income contingent loan system under this higher education contribution scheme, which was bringing in student charges. Then a couple of other different systems, since all with the income contingent loans, one with the student charges based essentially on likely future income of graduates. And then since 2021, with the student prices designed to incentivise course choices. Now, my broad theory of tuition fees around the world, at least around the OECD world, is that roughly speaking, there's a relationship between the size of government in a country and the way it finances its higher education system, and indeed other social services like health or retirement. And you can see the logic of this, that in countries with relatively high spending and taxation, say in Northern Europe, typically higher education is free or very, very cheap. In other European countries, there are small charges, small compared to Australia. Then we've got this cluster of countries in the Asia Pacific, which sort of have this mid-range size of government and similarly mid-range fees. And then you've got the USA and England with higher fees than any of these countries. And one of my theories here is that generally speaking, if the higher education funding system does not match the broader tax and welfare system in a country, it won't be stable. And I think this is one of the reasons why the free education period in Australia was not stable, because Australia doesn't really have, under our current tax arrangements, the capacity to finance that. Now, on the actual fees themselves, independent of the loans, I don't think there's any one rationale that is the right one. It all depends on the policy goals at the time and the political context. What I've got on the screen is a paper I wrote for the Centre for Study Higher Education at Melbourne Uni last year, which gives the history of these in Australia. But at some level, this is all idiosyncratic, because I think there are other policy goals and political contexts in other countries. So why did we reintroduce or introduce the charges in 1989, and then why did we introduce the loan scheme? Well, one of the reasons was, as I mentioned earlier, that in some ways this was not the free system was not consistent with the way Australia funds things. The then opposition Liberal Party did not support it. And within the governing Labor Party, there were people who didn't support it either. That effectively this was a union party. They thought that tuition subsidies for universities was basically getting the working class to fund middle class people. So there were these ideological objections to the system. But I think more fundamentally at the time was that the government of the day realised that there would be a large increase in demand for higher education. And there were two reasons for this. One was that there was a demographic surge, a very large birth cohort coming through the system, and that always has implications for higher education systems, because even with no change in underlying demand levels, a large birth cohort means more demand. And then we had in the 1980s a big increase in the number of people completing the final year of school in Australia, year 12. So over that decade, we go from transformation from 30-something% of people completing school to 60-something%. So those two things, as you can see on the chart, led to a major increase in the number of people completing school, and therefore potentially at least wanting to go on to university. The government also assumed at the time, and this has always been an important part of the public rhetoric around higher education in Australia, the government assumed that the Australian economy was changing in its structure, and this would lead to greater demand for workers with a bachelor degree or a higher qualification. Correspondingly, one of the reasons for the increased school retention in the 1980s was that it was becoming much harder for young people to leave school and get a full-time job as a teenager. Now, predicting where the labour force is going to go is always very difficult. What we saw in the subsequent years was that it was actually what we saw in the subsequent years was it didn't really increase the share of employment, at least for those early career people, until quite a long time after the expansion of the system. Part of that was a recession in the early 1990s, but also I think kind of a reminder that when we're trying to guess where the labour market is going to go, often we get it wrong. Now, going back. Now, even though changes in the labour market were an important part of government policy, this concept of social demand was mentioned earlier on. And I think this is very, very important, because what I think this is a cultural transformation in expectations around education that is partially linked to the labour market, but not entirely. And so what we see in Australia is that of first-year students, about 3/4 can nominate a job that they're interested in doing, but about 1/4 cannot. So even though they don't have concrete ideas about what they want to do with their careers, they nevertheless are at university anyway. And on the chart, what we can see here is that at least since the late 1980s, every survey of sort of late secondary school age students has found that a majority are at least interested in going to higher education. This differs between communities, and particularly with Australia's migrant communities. Aspirations for higher education are much higher than this, that a couple of migrant groups from India actually have the highest participation rates of any group in Australia, and more than double the levels of the Australia-born. So how was this going to be financed? So all student finance systems, I think, deal with this fundamental problem that young adults, who are the ideal market for higher education because they've got the maximum time to get the benefits from it, typically cannot self-finance a multi-year degree. And so all systems have these options. And I'd say that most systems, except perhaps commercial loans, at least use most of these to some degree, but often the different countries have different dominant methods. So we've got family payments and loans, philanthropy, which was important in Australia in the past, but it's less so now, commercial loans, which don't have much role in Australia, and government subsidy and government loans. They're within the public finance system. There are various options, subsidies and free to student, previously used in Australia, and as we see in the slide, common in Europe. Subsidies plus capped fees, so the government regulates the fees, and government loans, which is what most undergraduates in Australia do. Then no subsidy but a loan, which mostly applies to postgraduates in Australia and students in private colleges. And we also have a student income support system, which is means tested. So only about 1/4 of students actually get finance for living expenses in Australia. Now, when in the 1980s, Australia was considering or was planning to reintroduce student fees, This was a big policy and political problem because within the governing Labor Party at the time, there was a lot of concern that fees would deter particularly disadvantaged students from going on to higher education. So there had to be a system of avoiding upfront charges that would stop them going on and achieving a higher education degree. So there are different kinds of student loan systems. The one which is probably most common in the US is what we call a mortgage style system. So fixed installments over a period of time. But these have serious problems. In the United States, you've got huge problems with people defaulting on their debts, which affects their credit rating. And they're inflexible to life circumstances, such as taking off time to have children. And with women, typically the majority of students in most countries now, that is a particular problem. And so what happened instead in Australia was an economist at my university called Bruce Chapman developed something called an income contingent loan scheme, which had been floating around as an idea since the 1950s, but never attempted on a national policy basis. So the key elements of this was the HEC scheme, repayment, which is a percentage of income above income threshold level. It's flexible to life circumstances, but it has potential high costs to government, particularly in debt that will not ever be repaid. Now, one of the questions around income contingent loans is always how feasible are they from an administrative point of view? Now, you don't, strictly speaking, need to do it via the tax system like Australia does or New Zealand does or England does. But I think it's very difficult to do it otherwise because you have the difficulty of getting truthful accounts of how much students or graduates are actually earning. And then you've got all the enforcement problems of actually collecting what is owed. So my view is that the most practical way of making these loans work and making them better than the alternatives is a tax system that is capable of collecting the repayments. So in the late 1980s, Australia already had a high proportion of taxpayers in its pay-as-you-go system. So the system is that basically you have to tell your employer that you've got a HECS debt or a help debt as it later became. The employer just deducts the estimated amount of repayment from your weekly or monthly pay, sends that to the tax office, and then there's a final reconciliation when you submit your tax return. And so this really keeps the administrative costs of the system low because it largely piggybacks on the tax system that already exists. You need an IT system capable of keeping track of debts and debtors over long periods of time. In Australia, we don't actually write off the debt until someone dies. I think in England it was 30 years, now 40 years. Typically, tax officers operate on much shorter time cycles than this. And one of the practical issues in the 1980s was getting the IT right. It sounds mundane, but these things can cause, IT failures are a huge problem in public policy. And the other issue, which I understand would be a problem in Sri Lanka, but wasn't really thought of in Australia at the start, is overseas collection of debt. When graduates go overseas, how do you actually get them to repay? Last decade, I was sort of doing work about introducing one of these systems in Australia. New Zealand and England both have overseas repayment systems, or had at the time and still do, but they were having huge problems with actually getting people to repay. In Australia, we've only had it a few years. The last time I looked, repayments from overseas were about 70 million Australian dollars out of total repayments of about $5 billion. I've got no idea whether that's the right amount, but it sounds very low to me. So I suspect that we have got the same problem that all the other countries have, which is that at least while they are overseas, compliance is really hard. And really the only practical way is probably to get them if they do come back to Australia. And in New Zealand, they actually started arresting people at the airport who were not actually repaid. So that is draconian. Now, income contingent loans are designed to transfer some of the repayment risk from the students or graduates and to the government. but controlling losses, I think, is a really important design feature. Like the whole point of this is it's going to be cheaper to the government, a cheaper way to the government of expanding the system than will otherwise be the case. And so if the money isn't collected, it's defeating the whole policy purpose. And so the most important stuff is the thresholds for repayment, which I'll get to, but there are various other things that can be done. So we did extend, so the original HEC scheme was only for higher education. We've got a separate vocational training system in Australia. We did extend it to the vocational system. This was a disaster, partly because it was open to corruption and there was terrible corruption in it, which ended up costing a lot of money, but also because there were a lot of courses in the vocational sector where the typical person with that qualification doesn't earn very much and therefore always fell below the threshold for repayment. And so what we do now, we have a much smaller scheme in vocational education, and it's basically restricted to courses where the government thinks there are reasonable prospects of actually getting repayment. You can have caps on the fees that could be supported by loans, which is what we do have for the government subsidised places in Australia, which I think is probably also politically wise, so people aren't frightened of deregulated fees. You can have limits on how much a person can borrow, which we do have in Australia, and you can limit the eligible higher education institutions. In the US, there are some rules around whether they have good employment outcomes. We don't have that, but we can introduce controls if we need to. Another big issue is whether there is interest on the student debt or not. So in England, there is a real interest rate on student debt. In New Zealand, there's no interest rate, fair loan scheme, if people within New Zealand. What we've done instead is link it to consumer price inflation, which has been uncontroversial for almost all the time since HECS was introduced, but has been very controversial over the last 12 months because Australia is in an inflationary period, and this has meant that people are seeing their debts going up by sometimes large amounts of money, and this has caused a lot of concern amongst people with student debt. The other system we've used is adding a loan fee, so to sort of increase the capital debt of the borrowers. I don't have any fundamental objection to this, but in Australia, this has been applied in a very arbitrary and unfair way. So the most important, I think, issue, both from a political and a financial sense, is where you set the initial threshold for repayment. So below that, people don't repay. Obviously, if it's set too high, you don't get enough people actually repaying. If it's set too low, it has too much of an impact on their living standards and is likely to cause political problems. So as you can see in Australia, this has gone up and down over time. At the start, it was designed, the introduction of charges was basically sold as saying you won't have to repay unless you earn at least an average wage. But that really leads to an overly high threshold, and this has led to not enough people repaying, which is why in more recent times, we've seen a lower threshold, which is also more sensible for the vocational education borrowers. Australia also has a quite unusual repayment system compared to other countries like England and New Zealand, which also have income contingent loans based on the Australian system. So in England and New Zealand, you pay a percentage of your income above the threshold. So I think in New Zealand, it's about 12% of your income above the threshold. In England, it's about 9%. In Australia, we do it differently, which is that once you reach the threshold, you pay a percentage of your entire income, not just the amount above the threshold. As you see, we changed this over time, and now we've got this really complex system where we've got 18 thresholds with mostly half a percentage point increments between them. And with each time you move over one of these increments, we've got this repayment cliff where you suddenly pay a significantly extra amount of money. And what this means compared to the mortgage-based system is that sort of down the bottom, 1% of your income, you repay much less than you would under a sort of flat installment model under the mortgage system. But at the top are the 10%, which currently cuts in at about $141,000 Australian. You're paying $14,000, which is way more than what you would pay if you had a flat system. I think this system has probably meant that Australia's system is in a better financial situation, and particularly the English system, because I think England has a lot of people sitting just above the threshold. And so if you're £1,000 above the threshold, you repay £90 a year, you're never ever going to repay your student debt. And so one of the reasons their system looks bad financially is this issue. But our system does have the downside of these big sudden increases in repayments. And there have been studies showing that this is causing or has caused some manipulation of income. So people have questionable deductions and other strategies to try and bring their income back below a threshold, which obviously impacts general tax revenue as well as repayments of student debt. But just finish on this last slide. Despite these problems, and despite claims over the years as student charges have gone up that this will deter students or deter students from disadvantaged backgrounds, or the loan scheme will trigger debt aversion, while these effects may be true of some individuals, in the aggregate, that hasn't happened. What we see here is, with a few dips, a fairly continuous and substantial increase in the percentage of young people in Australia going on to university compared to the historical levels. And looping back to the social demand point, once you get social demand at a fairly high level, really the critical policy issue is not so much encouraging demand or removing price blocks of demand, it is increasing supply in the system. And the great strength of income contingent loans is that they enable governments with limited tax bases to increase the number of places at university well beyond what they would have been able to do if we had kept the free education system that we had in the 1970s and 1980s. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I think there'll be questions, and I have quite a few, but we'll come to those. I'll now go to Professor Biswajit. So Biswajit, if you can share.
Thank you, Dr. Gamage.
Yes.
I'll share my screen first. Is it visible?
Yes. You can do slideshow, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you. I congratulate and thank Professor Andrew Norton for his excellent presentation on the issues relating to student loan in Australia. And my respect to Professor Sampath Amaratunge, Honorable Chairman, UGC Sri Lanka, and all the participants and organizers here. I thank the organizers especially for giving me the opportunity to speak before. As we can see, I mean, I have been asked to talk about the social demand for higher education in Bangladesh. My focus will be on both publicly funded and privately managed universities and affiliated colleges under them. The laws which govern or the policies we have for higher education in Bangladesh include the constitution as well, constitution of the country. Article 17 of the constitution provides for free and compulsory education to all children as decided by the law afterwards. And currently, up to graduation, they don't need to pay tuition fees in Bangladesh. The fees they pay are very nominal, I mean, a few pence per month, something like that. And we have an education policy. Latest one is 2010 education policy. We have a strategic plan for higher education in Bangladesh, which talks about student loan as well. We are planning to start that very soon. And for every public university, we have a different separate legislation. And for all non-government universities, we have a single legislation. The latest one was enacted in 2010, Non-Government University Act 2010. At first, if we talk about the number of students and teachers at government-funded universities, including all affiliated and constituent colleges, currently we have 56 government-funded universities. 3 are new, 53 are in operation. The number of total students is 4.131 million, 132 million. And number of total teachers is 0.16 for about 0.164 million. The number, the ratio, teacher-student ratio is to 25. As you can see, these universities are funded by the government, and it includes all the colleges as well, tertiary level colleges. And if we talk about only the universities, excluding the colleges, affiliated or constituent colleges, and public universities, the number I have already mentioned, 56 and 53 are in operation. Total students, number of students is 0.28 or 29 million, and total teachers 15,236. The ratio is student-teacher ratio is to 19. This is as per the UGC annual report of 2021. And when we focus on privately funded and managed universities, non-government universities, currently we have 112 universities, 102 are in operation. Total number of students is 0.31 million, and number of teachers, total teachers is 15,393. The ratio is, teacher-student ratio is to 20. And when we talk about budget and expenditure, public universities are mostly funded by the government, and a very insignificant amount comes from their own income, university's own income. The total budget of fiscal year 2021 was $63.09 million US. The government fund was 41,809 million US dollars. Sorry, that's taka. 510 million, about 510 million US dollars, and their own finance was about 129 million US dollars. So most of the fund comes from the government for public universities. And if we look at non-government universities, total budget in 2021 was 4.45 million US dollars. and I mean, no money is provided by the government for them. When we calculate per student expenditure per year, every year, as for public universities, average 2,300, about 2,300 US dollar is spent for a student per year, a student of a public university, and the highest amount is spent for medical students at Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, not medical students, it's aviation and aerospace university students. Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman Aviation and Aerospace University, they spend 0.788 million taka, that is 9,614 US dollar per student per year. And another university, the public university, they spend about, I mean, the lowest amount spent is by Borishal University, which is 536 US dollar per year per student. And at private universities, average expenditure for per student is about 1,039 US dollar per year. Subsidies provided by the non-government universities for themselves include, there is a law, and the law, they are bound to follow that law. Total 6% students, at least 6% students are supposed to get full free scholarship. 3% among them are from poor and meritorious students who come from remote areas, and the remaining 3% are the children of freedom fighters. But it is we hardly find any children of freedom fighters now, because the age of the country is about 52 years now. So the children of freedom fighters are not children. I mean, they are not students. Their age is, more than the age of average students. No portion of this budget of private universities or non-government universities is given from the government. And affiliated, when we talk about affiliated and constituent colleges, medical colleges under medical universities, they are run by the government, and private medical colleges are privately run and managed. Privately run means the, expenditure comes from the tuition fees actually, and managed privately. Presently, there are 37 government medical colleges and 72 private medical colleges who offer MBBS programs, Bachelor of Medicine and Bachelor of Surgery programs. And government, non-government, and private colleges, other than the medical colleges under the National University, there are 2,257 colleges who offer tertiary degree programs, tertiary level academic programs under the National University. And government pays all the expenditure for government colleges, and also the government pay the salaries and other cost, development and other relevant or related costs for non-government universities also. So these payments normally don't come from private sector. These are also paid by the government for non-government colleges. And there are Islamic education system also. There are about there are 1,349 madrasas, which are regulated by Islamic Arabic University and government. Many of them are government and others are non-government, but the expenditure is borne by the government, all the expenditures. We have already mentioned something about medical education. There are 37 medical colleges public and 72 private. And there are approximately 3,729 seats per year in government medical colleges and about 6,000 in private medical colleges. There is a huge competition for the admission, and there is an exact figure. Only 0.139 million students took part in the admission test in 22-23. MBBS tuition fee is taka 1.95 million per year, and which is $19,047 in the private medical colleges. But there is no tuition fee for medical students at public medical colleges. I mentioned that there is a fee which is a few pence per month, not even $1. Total budget for the bachelor level health education provided by the government was for 2021 fiscal year about $100 million. It is not shown in the university budget I discussed earlier. So this is separate, and this is not included in that university budget. Research budget for fiscal year 2021, if we discuss,
we can finish in about 3-4 minutes. Yeah.
I will need another minute maybe.
Okay, good.
UGC Bangladesh provided $1.89 million as grants, and public universities have spent $9.91 million. Non-government universities have spent $14.62 million. Total research budget was $25.73 million for 2021, and you know that that was affected by COVID-19 anyway. We did not mention anything about the expenditure or budget we have for veterinary colleges, different research institutes under the Ministry of Livestock and Fisheries, agricultural institutes, rice research institutes, and other institutes under the Ministry of Agriculture. And also we did not mention that in the budget for various institutes under the Ministry of Culture. Finally, our Honorable Prime Minister urges the public universities. She urged on January 19, 2023, in a meeting with all the vice chancellors of public universities, to raise own funds for development. So we are thinking that they should not be dependent on the public fund only, or the taxpayers' money, on the taxpayers' money only. They should try to create their own funds through alumni and other sources. And that's all today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think we really need to take a close look at this and benchmark our own data, but thank you so much for pulling all that together for us. Now I'm going to go to Professor Amaratunge.
1 second. As I mentioned last night, that I have a meeting with our ministers after, half an hour, something like that. I'll be connected. I'll remain connected, but I will be traveling. Is that okay?
That's fine. That's fine. Let me see if there are any questions. Yes. Just when you said per student spending, did that include capital and recurrent both? It's per student spending. That's quite significant, the per student spending numbers you showed for.
sorry, the students?
Per student spending by public universities you gave in US dollars.
Hmm.
Yeah. That's a detail. We will get to that. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir. Okay.
If we can share your slides later, that'd be really helpful. Then I will go to Professor Amaratunge. Professor Amaratunge,
Thank you
please.
very much.
Yeah. And yes, when you leave, you can just leave a note. But thank you so much again. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Professor Amaratunge.
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening from Colombo. Professor Andrew Norton from Australia, Dr. Tara Dimel, former Secretary to the Ministry of Education, Dr. Sujata Gamage, and also Professor Biswajit Chanda from UGC Bangladesh. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk about the current higher education system in the country and recommendations which we have made to the government. So these are set of information.
Yeah.
And before this, I just want to mention that we have 17 national universities. Attached to these 17 national universities, we have 19 national institutes, including 10 postgraduate institutes, like Postgraduate Institute of Medicine, Postgraduate Institute of Science, so on. And also, we have a non-state sector. We don't use the concept or the name that private university. So we say non-state. And so you can see from 2017 to 2022, you can see this is grade 1 admissions of government schools. 2017, it was 322,135. And this is around 300,000. And number set for O-levels, again, similar to that number. Then number set for advanced level, this is like London A-levels and London O-levels. This is the entry for universities, especially for public universities. So that is also around 290,000, 300,000 like. Number qualified for university admission, it's about 170,000. So we have minimum standards to enter national universities. So it's a parliamentary act specified minimum qualifications to enter to medical colleges. Then number applied for university admissions, it's around 75,000, 91,000 like. Then number admitted is very important. 2017, it's 30,000. You can see a drastic change, a huge jump in 2020. The government have taken a decision, clear decision, to increase the intake by 10,000. It's huge increase of 33% of national university admissions. And slowly we are increasing, and at the moment it's about 44,000. And I just want to mention here, this is all free of charge. In Sri Lanka, the education is free when it is come to the government sector. That has ensured everybody. So education is the culture. So then not only education, even health facilities are free of charge. Then number admitted, it's now 44,000. We have increased that milestone from 30,000. The next slide.
Yeah, I think.
There is a technical error, I suppose.
Yeah, need to go down.
I cannot go to the.
You can see on your computer, you can keep talking.
Slide.
I can see, I mean, some statistics related to school and higher education. This slide.
Okay.
Next slide is also
This is the next slide.
I can
You can see this gives very important statistics here. So we take 43,927 for public universities, and we have another 5 universities, but those are not coming under the purview of University Grants Commission. Those 5 universities are coming under their respective universities, other state universities, 2,760, non-state institutions, 16,000 the annual intake, and foreign affiliated degrees. We have few British universities offering degrees in Sri Lanka, and also we have few Australian universities offering degrees, and 1 or 2 Indian universities as well. And the intake of those universities come around 9,000 per annum. And most of the students in these affiliated universities, they finish 2 years here and go to the mother university to finish the qualification. Then external degrees offered by national universities, they also take nearly 10,000. And higher diploma and diplomas, National College of Education, these are teacher training colleges. We have 19 teacher training colleges, and they are giving 3-year higher diploma for teachers before they take into the teaching profession. Then higher national diploma, 11,338, National Diploma of Technology, and other state higher education institutes, very small ones. Then again, non-state, and 29,000 go abroad annually. So we all know Monash, if I'm correct, in Sri Lankan rupees, 100 million for the MBBS. And just now, Professor Biswajit given information about Bangladesh MBBS. You can just imagine 29,000 going abroad for higher studies. So this is the breakdown. What we have done so far. You can see medicine, dental, and vet. We have taken 1,660. And now we have increased this to 2,308. Engineering, it was 2,443. Within 3 years' time, we have increased to 3,214. The percentage of increase is 33%. Science and agriculture, allied health, indigenous medicine, the increase is 41% in the country within last 2 years. And technology, 48%. Law, 34%. Management, arts, you can see the total increase is 31%, 43,927. This shows the breakdown again inside universities. Arts and law is huge, 26.2. Actually, law is very small component. Arts, almost 25%. And management, 18%. Science, 16.9. Technology, 8.1. So we have a policy to increase STEM education in the country. And drastically, government is trying to expand this area. These are very important in general education. Number of schools, those who offer advanced level, numbers are 2,952. The problem here is schools having the science stream is only 34.25. That's the problem of expanding science. So schools not having science stream is huge, 65.75. So the 65.75 schools have only arts or arts and commerce. So government has taken remedies to rapidly increase this science base in order to produce more science graduates by national universities. And these are some of the statistics. Those who have done extremely well in O-levels, that is 9 A's, 8 A's you can see, but because they don't have science stream in the school or the close by, so they go to the arts stream. So these are the statistics: 9 A's, 239, 8 A's, 325, 7 A's, 754, so on. So this is about employability. The president is very much concerned about this science expansion. And we are now concerned about increasing this MBBS opportunities for another 5,000 and to increase engineering qualification for another 5,000 and giving non-state sector also to participate in producing graduates. So you can see medicine, it's 100%, IT 96%, engineering 91%. 3 months after releasing results, and allied health science 74.8. We have a huge sector here for allied health sciences. Agriculture, management, and science, within 3 months, it is 70%. And after 6 months, this goes to 85%. And technology stream, we have just started in universities. Only last year, they have succeeded in BSc technology. And arts is the problem. Huge unemployability is there. Their employability ratio is 28.5. So government has taken drastic changes to overcome this massive problem of unemployability of arts graduates. From this year onwards, government is going to offer double degrees in arts faculties. So they can study their respective area plus IT in computer science. So we have already established IT and computer science departments in all arts faculties of the country. And Treasury has released cadres for these institutes, and World Bank funded, of course, a long-term loan, a huge amount to develop computer facilities, laboratories, networking, air conditioning, everything in arts faculties to teach IT and computer science for arts graduates. So SLASCOM is the software engineering society in the country. So they actually got together with University Grants Commission, and then we offer this IT and computer science diploma, higher diploma, and degree for arts graduates. So SLASCOM, again, that society has given the endorsement to the nation that they are going to absorb these arts graduates with the IT qualification in the industry in order to reduce this employability to zero. Then for the last 3 years, you can see the development. Government has established 2 new universities, 15 new faculties, 63 new departments, all based on science, and 72 undergraduate degree programs, 95 postgraduate degree programs, and external degrees, 9. This total 9 based on STEM. And after A-levels, we had a huge problem. University Grants Commission was the body to enroll students, and we have taken more than 1 year, sometimes 15 months to issue cutoff. That is after A-levels to take students into universities. Now these 15 months have reduced to 2.5 months. From this year onwards, now we are planning to issue cutoffs within a month. Then the waiting time to come to a university will drastically come down. So we have computerized the system, and only the digital application mode is accepted. And so many decisions have taken, and Cabinet has explained and given us so many concessions and helps in order to computerize the system. And we are planning to issue cutoff this year within a month because of these new changes. These are the admission changes. I'm not going to details. So this is very important. This graph shows how we have conducted our university programs during the COVID. So these are the waves taken place in the country. So you can see 2020 January, March 20.
Professor, we will finish in about 2 minutes. Yeah,
All right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. You can see
Yes.
we have not experienced this video conferencing. So we have started video conferencing with the close down of the country. So March 20th, we have closed down the country for several months. So during that period, we have started this. And personally, UGC wrote to the Zoom US and asking help to develop Zoom parallel servers in the country in order to provide Zoom facility for universities free of charge. So Zoom US have given us free of charge so many accounts, and the government of the country requested all service providers to provide free data for all public universities. So even today, if the students come on board, study on LMS through their respective websites in Sri Lanka, it's free. So because of that, you can see how many sessions we have done. And some weeks, 200K. And you can see participation, 7.5 million. ADB have done research on this, how Sri Lanka achieved this marvelous goals. So somehow UGC have done groundwork, and because of this development in Sri Lanka, we don't have a backlog today. So we are happy to just tell that the higher education in the country is running without a backlog with this one. So ADB has praised Sri Lanka several times in several international forums, and they have taken this example and clearly mentioned in their research papers. This is similar to Japan as well. So I'm going to stop my presentation at this point because the time is limited. And this is the summary of what is having. I just want to tell, this is all free. And whether you have money or not, doesn't matter. So you can come, and maybe 1 or 2 slides I just want to show you. These are about ranking. I'm not going to touch that. This is just Scopus papers we publish, 622 by Peradeniya, because UGC monitor their research, their education, and every standards. And you can see Colombo, 643, Scopus, Jayawardenepura close to 500, and Moratuwa 650. So these are a few other universities. So these are the slides and information I want to mention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. I hope you can stay a bit longer because I think there'll be a lot of questions because we have increased enrollment. And I think one interesting thing I noticed is that the Bangladesh had a Private Universities Act in 1992. And since then, the graduate output from public and private universities are more or less equal now. So the non-state sector has grown, and I think despite having a loan system or anything, but Sri Lanka, we have a interest-free loan system. Do you want to say something about that?
Yes. We have this interest-free loan system, and students are given nearly 1 million rupees to study in a non-state university. Even though we are in a crisis situation at the moment, government is continuously funding private students for their studies, and there is a huge demand for non-state sector as well, because as I explained, another 70,000 is waiting to come to universities. So somehow we have to educate these 70,000 in order to run the country to a developed status. And especially the government is promoting at the moment the science base. So the money allocation, these interest-free loans from two big banks of the country, especially for STEM education.
Thank you. And I think there were some other questions. One question, I think, if you have any questions, please raise hand using reactions. Please do raise hands. I don't see any raised hands, but I saw there were some comments. There was one comment, Professor, about whether when you increase rapidly by 10,000, what were the quality concerns? And is the government committed to increasing spending in this crisis situation? Have you got any assurance from the government about
Yes. Yes, actually, we had maybe hundreds of meetings with vice chancellors, deans of faculties, heads of departments, academia, and all stakeholders. And we invited proposals for the and then we have formed a formula for funding, which actually approved by all vice chancellors of the country. So I have explained this funding formula in detail. And unfortunately, I want to mention here, the World Bank agreed for this expansion, the funding source, but with the announcement of the bankrupt, so they have stopped funding for the expansion. And I have wrote several times, since this is education, we have done the expansion. We cannot stop the expansion. We have given hopes. So even though this is bankrupt, so we have to continue, right? So UGC is struggling with donor agencies, funding agencies, and Treasury as well. And the World Bank also very helpful. And because of the policies, they also can't come out from the standards. But we are working very, very closely with the Sri Lankan World Bank office. And with the status of this, we will be getting proper funding from the World Bank as well.
I think there'll be questions about how we expand through donor funding. And actually, there's somebody question from Vimal Kannagar, how sustainable is this funding in the long term? Rohan Samrajiva, can you unmute and ask a question? There's only one hand. Please raise your hands. And Professor Norton, I have some questions for you.
My question is to Professor Norton. From the perspective of the university, when they are making up their budgets, do they get all their revenues from the students, and how the students get their money, whether they get loans or grants or whatever, that is not visible to the university, but the university looks out at the world, and it gets some subsidies from government and some money from the students. If you can give us a sense of what it looks from the perspective of a university, say like ANU, and what the proportions are, the ratios are, how much from the students, how much from the government.
So for the domestic undergraduates, which is the largest student population, the universities get an overall funding rate, which varies by discipline. There's a public subsidy, which again is set by discipline. And then there is something we call a student contribution, which is a maximum amount the university can charge the student, but in practice, they almost always charge the maximum. About 90% of students take out a HEX help loan to cover that. but that money never passes through their bank accounts. Basically the government pays that money direct to the university and then recovers the money from the student through the income-dependent loan system later on. Then you've got separate funding for research, and then you've got essentially private funding, mainly international students, even though that's obviously gone down due to Australia having closed borders for the best part of 2 years. But nevertheless, it's a very important part of most universities' income. So overall, in cash flow terms, I think it's about 54% of university revenue comes from the national government, a few percent from state and local governments, and the rest is private sources. So Australian universities are quite reliant on private funding. That includes fees, that includes donations, that includes contract research, that includes their commercial operations. So they do have quite diversified funding bases, whereas if you go back to the free education period, about 90% of their revenue came from the national government. So they were very reliant on the national government at that point.
If I may have a short follow-up,
Sure.
what does this do to the sort of the predictability of funding? Like, for example, when something like COVID hit, did the universities have to lay off staff? Some things that we have seen in the US, that kind of phenomena?
So the government guaranteed its funding regardless of student demand. So that kind of made that safe. But the universities realised that their international student fee revenue would go down because Australia's borders were closed and therefore international students simply couldn't arrive. In the end, it didn't quite turn out as badly as the universities expected. And one of the main reasons was the Chinese students in particular proved to be surprisingly willing to study online. And so one university, University of Sydney, actually managed to increase its international student revenue despite the closed borders, which was quite a remarkable effort. But most of the universities had significant reductions in revenue, and they did introduce quite heavy staff cuts in order to bring their spending back in line with their revenue. In 2020, late 2020, the government did announce some special extra funding for the following year, but the universities had already cut their staff. And so possibly the staff cuts were bigger in hindsight than they needed to be, but nevertheless, it was the most traumatic experience for Australian universities essentially since World War II. So even though they had periods of funding constraint in the past, this was really the first period where a major revenue source had gone significantly backwards over a fairly short period of time. And the worst effects of this were actually in 2022. We sort of lost the pipeline effect of the international students that should have started in 2020 and 2021. And so the university annual reports are coming out sort of around now. And I think so far, it's been about 20 that have reported, and I think about 18 of the 20 have reported losses. So a pretty significant hit to them.
Oh, thank you. I have there's one question, but before that, did some quick calculations using a Parliament report. I just want to get your thoughts on that. About 50% would come, they looked at the whole higher education sector, and about 50% come from as a direct grants to universities, and about 15% as help contributions, and 35% direct payment by students. And of those, mostly would be from foreign students. Somehow this other income was not there. So, but does that sound like reasonable percentages? I've been using that in
roughly.
some.
So the international students, international pre-COVID were about 25% of income overall, but more at some institutions. So that's pretty significant. The government share has government rarely cuts in total by any drastic amounts, but because the private share has been going up more quickly, the government share has been shrinking as a percentage of the all. I think from memory, it was 40-something% are grants, and then sort of another 15% are loans, which of course, in the way the accounting is done, actually some of those loans are in fact costs because they'll never be repaid, but we sort of don't typically count from the university's point of view. They don't really see it that way. They don't see that subsidy.
Yeah, so the students are actually paying about 15-20% of the total cost. The rest is either government or...
But of the funding rate that they pay, so for their own education, it's really, it varies between the disciplines, but on average, it's sort of now well into the 40-something% of the nominal cost of their degree. So that is really, it's very high by Australian historical standards, and possibly it will be pushed back. At the moment, there's a big review of Australian higher education policy going on. I think there will be pressure to, increase the subsidy. Unfortunately, even though Australia's not relying on a World Bank or anything like that, it does have a tight budgetary situation, and therefore it'll be, very competitive with other demands on public spending to be able to increase the subsidies. Plus, we have another of these demographic surges coming through. So there was a lot of babies born in sort of the late 2000s in Australia, and they're going to be arriving at university age in the second half of this decade.
Yes, I will go take a question from Dushi Pillai. Please unmute and put your question. Ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the speakers for the really interesting presentation on the 3 different perspectives. My question is to the chairman of the Sri Lankan UGC. I was really interested to see that up to 65% of the schools do not have a science stream, and presumably that affects a lot of rural schools, schools with no internet connections, etc. So I would like to hear a bit more about what is the current sort of plan or roadmap to address this issue. Thank you.
Okay, is Professor Amaratunge? Yes, please.
Yeah, actually, I have just explained the situation, and I'm not representing the general education. The UGC purview is higher education, even though what I can tell you, there is a restructuring program is going on, and the president is very much concerned about spreading science and math streams all over. So the Ministry of Education and the National Education Institute, all of them are working together, and they have to train teachers, and they have to develop laboratories and the infrastructure, everything. So some kind of changes are taking place with the help of ADB and the World Bank at the moment.
Thank you. I can't see any hands, but I have a question from actually Professor Norton and Professor Biswajit, whether we can get some idea of how you prioritize school education over higher education, because as you can see in Sri Lanka, we do have a real pipeline problem. And, then you put money into school education, you put more money into higher education, then less money into school education. How do you balance that? I will ask Professor Norton whether he has any statistics or any notion that he can share with us, and Professor Biswajit as well.
School education. Oh, sorry.
Professor Biswajit, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gamage. I think I have pronounced it correctly now.
Sure, no problem.
Yeah.
And your name is Chanda, right? Okay.
And school education, you know that we have several systems in Bangladesh for school education, public, private, and Islamic as well. So, I mean, the government schools and non-government schools, they are funded by, if we don't talk about private schools, which are English medium, apart from those schools, other schools are funded by the government, even non-government ones also funded by the government. And I mean, the ministry is also different. There are two different ministries, one for primary and mass education, and the other one is secondary and higher education. So there is no problem with the budget. They submit the budget separately, and I mean, it is a long time practice that whatever they need, they propose in the budget, the primary sector, and whatever the higher secondary and higher education they need, they also submit their budget. So I mean, it is not in that way. The question you put before me, we don't think in that way. I mean, it is need-based, and the government approves the budgets as per the need. Am I
Yes.
clear?
Yeah, I think maybe we'll have to get the per student spending later, because I think it's really important to benchmark per student spending in Bangladesh and in Sri Lanka and maybe another country or two, for us to just to get some sense of per student spending. For you gave
Student spending, I mentioned only for tertiary level students, not
Yes.
for primary students.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I did not go through that.
No, that's fine. Yeah, but maybe we could maybe talk to you about that later. Professor Norton, could you please tell us a little bit about the sort of how you balance those priorities, school education versus higher education? Is it possible? If it's not possible to ask, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I can say one thing, which is in Australia, the school sector is more politically powerful than the higher education sector. And they have been far more successful in extracting additional government funding than has the higher education sector. And I guess this is partly just the reality of numbers. There are far more school students than there are university students, and their parents vote, whereas I think there is probably a mentality that once people reach adulthood, they're a bit more responsible for paying themselves. On top of that, there are these complex debates, particularly in Australia. We've had this debate about the importance of early childhood education, particularly the first 3 years, with an argument that improvements in early childhood could lead to dramatic lifelong improvements, particularly for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And again, there's been a lot of extra public money invested in early childhood education. Whether this will actually pan out, I'm not sure. I know there are skeptical voices here about whether except for maybe the most disadvantaged, whether this is really just much more than childcare, but nevertheless, that is kind of where it's going politically. I'm not really competent to make the precise trade-offs as to where the greatest gains are going to be.
But thank you very much for that observation that the school sector is more powerful politically. Probably in Sri Lanka, it's probably the other way around. Yeah. So that's an interesting observation. My colleague, Dr. Tara Dimel, really was the Secretary for Education, responsible for some major reforms. I don't know, she said she has to leave. Tara, are you here? Could you just make some comments about
I just want to ask Professor Sampath a few clarifications, if I may. Professor Sampath, UGC Chair, are you there, Professor Sampath?
Yes.
Just a few things. I mean, would you say that over the years, I'm just trying to analyze your stats when you're doing the slide presentation, would you say that the higher education sector, the non-state higher education sector has been increasing over the last several years? Is that your observation, with a comparatively or a relative decrease in demand for the state universities, whilst the higher education institutions managed through the non-state sector seem to be increasing? I think there are about 75 private or non-state higher education institutions right now, for which students all pay fees. Is that your observation as well, Professor Sampath?
Yes, Dr. Tara. Now, demand for public universities is still there. As we all know, we select only very small percentage for public universities. So demand is there. There is no question about demand for public universities. At the same time, non-state sector have increasing demand. And we have a couple of good universities established in Sri Lanka, I mean affiliated universities. Some of the universities are accredited. Now, for an example, if you take management, AACBS is the world's the highest accreditation body. So we have few universities, few business schools offering foreign qualifications in the country with that accreditation. So openly speaking, none of our business schools are not accredited by that place. So because of that, so we can see, you know, now there is a competition for everybody to improve quality, standards, and all public universities are now very much concerned about accreditation at the moment. And they are also planning to go for accreditations. For an example, AACBS, the business accreditation. Few universities are about to launch their applications. So competition is good, and we can see increasing amount of students are trying to come for these affiliated universities, those who can finish 2 years here and go to Canada, 2 years here and go to Australia or England. So that combination is now very much popular.
So in other words, there doesn't appear to be much of a hesitation in terms of paying a fee.
Yes. When it is come to going abroad, it's happening.
Okay.
And also, if you take Australia, according to my knowledge, after the degree, they allow temporary visa to work 3 years, right? And even during the studies, they can earn some money. So if the parents can pay the tuition fees, then they will be able to earn money, and that is for the accommodation. So like that, because here the culture is education.
So other thing is, I just want to pick up on what
Yes,
Dr. Sujata, my colleague, said earlier, where you talked about the increasing numbers of enrollments, and there was a jump from 30,000 odd to 40,000 over a span of several years. I'm just wondering whether this, whilst that is good, salutary, I'm just wondering whether there is a commensurate increase in the number of lecturers who are available to teach these students, and whether there is a quality check on these lecturers and the types of education they are getting. Because the last time I checked, I think it was in a newspaper article that we had something like 1,500 deficits in terms of the academic staff numbers. I don't know whether I got the numbers correct, Professor. I just want to make sure that you have these large numbers getting enrolled, whether we are in a position to deliver a good quality education to them. That's my question.
Yes. At the moment, vacancies, permanent vacancies in the system is more than 2,000. More than 2,000. And if you take Jaffna, for their anatomy department, they are waiting to fulfill professor of anatomy for several years, and nobody is applying. And if you consider the Colombo-based universities, still there is a huge demand. Recently, we have started University of Amaratunge medical faculty. There is a demand for that. But Rajarata University, medical faculty, we have started 15 years ago, but still we have problems of recruiting high quality, good academic staff there. So we are surviving with the consultants of the hospital there, taking their services, and those who have retired from the system are given opportunities to work in those places, in those universities. So it's not, very easy to handle and keep the quality as well. As you know, we have a common test system in all medical faculties, and we prepare finally the common list for the country. So we set common test papers for all medical faculties. So because of that, you have to keep standards. Otherwise, when we prepare the merit list, your students won't get a good place in the common merit list. So there are so many ways to check and balance the quality at the moment. And people are leaving a lot of young PhDs at the moment. And we want to, retain them somehow. And government also trying to help young PhDs to somehow retain in the country. So places like Uavellassa, we are going to establish a new medical faculty, because the teaching hospital of Badulla is huge. And even at the moment, we have 64 consultants working in the hospital. So taking that into consideration, we are going to establish medical faculty at UA. And the demand for medical faculties is huge. And in 2019, those who have got all 3 A passes for bioscience, just you imagine how it is difficult, but 20 students did not get university entrance for bioscience 3 A passes. But luckily at the moment with this expansion, now we are able to accommodate all 3 A passes.
Yeah, my final very quick question, and then after that I'm going to stop. Just to ask whether at the UGC, whether you have considered with regards to the admission criteria, because still the universities individually do not do their own enrollments. It's a centralized system, which the UGC oversees. And also the combination of subjects. I think Sri Lanka is one of the very few countries that still uses these streams. We have 7 streams, as you know.
Yes.
And you said about the technological stream that was the last to be introduced. Now, instead of having that kind of complicated process, whether you could allow students to select 3 to 4 subjects from a basket of subjects, like it is done in many, many parts of the world, that's just a kind of a suggestion to you. And also whether the student admission, if it is decentralized to every single university, then this long gap of, doing the cutoff marks, and like you said, it took 1 year and now it took 2 months and now it's getting less, whether that kind of progressive reform is being considered. And I'm sure the UGC is in the process of thinking on those lines as well, Professor.
Dr. Dimel, you have asked 2 questions. One is this decentralization of admission. If I answer you, we had an ethnic conflict. We suffered a lot. And at the moment, if you go to any government office in Jaffna, all officers are Tamil officers. Then if you come to Colombo, 100% Sinhala officers. Even if you come to a school, same. If you go to the south, 100% Sinhala students in all our schools. If you go to the East, same. But if you go to Jaffna University, 50% Sinhala students. They are living in common hostels. They eat in common canteens. So the friendship for this conflict, actually, the remedies are offered by higher education. But if you look at the staff combination of Jaffna, they have 1 or 2 Sinhala academic staff. And if you come to Sri Jayawardhanapura or Kalaniya or Colombo, very few Tamil academic staff. So when you give the authority to select, this may happen. Jaffna may select all Tamils. And Jayawardhanapura, we have 750 to 1,000 Tamil students. If our people select only one ethnic group, I don't know the future of this country. Only these higher educational institutes are superb examples of harmony. And because of this national selection, I think we have this facility. That is my personal view. I have explained this several places, madam.
Thank you.
Right. You want to take on that or will? Yeah, okay. No, I think probably we need to take other considerations as well. That's one consideration. But I would ask Sajiva Mipage, please unmute and ask a question. Can you? Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sujata, for giving the time. My name is Sajiva. I actually have a kind of a comment, then a question as well. I think the discussion is focused more towards on the higher education, and but I have a kind of a question around the general education, which links to the higher education. And I appreciate the presenter's contribution and Professor Sampath and other contributors, enlightening us on what's happening. And I have, as a Sri Lankan, I really appreciate what University Grants Commission are currently doing to change the situation. From my point of view, I think our main issue is not, with the higher education. We have an issue in, alignment from general education to skills, tertiary education, and to the higher education. So when we analyze the data and when we are looking at, we have a huge learning crisis where nearly 40% of our students who sat for O levels not get a pass for mathematics and English, right? So that's also created a huge issue in going into the higher education pathways. And then we get our highly intellectual cream of our youth into the universities because of our system that helps university to sustain really well. They produce high quality graduates. Now, in terms of this employability discussion that came in, now in the general education in many developed countries and the system, they have a very thorough career guidance path in their when they finish their general education. But Sri Lanka, we actually don't have a policy even. So I would like to ask from Professor Sampath, how you think and how you see the link between this higher education and the general education, how that important, and how these policy like career guidance will help to solve these unemployability issues in the higher education sectors. Thank you.
Yeah, just before that, Rohan, do you still have a question or you want to lower your hand?
Yes, I do. Perhaps
we'll take that as well. And
yeah, it's a short question directed to all three resource persons. In Professor Amaratunge's comments, I heard the inkling of incentives to improve quality, where because the non-state universities were granting highly accredited, acclaimed business degrees, the local business schools were gearing up to go for accreditation. My question for both our colleagues from Bangladesh and Australia, is what are the incentives in their funding schemes and admission schemes for universities to improve quality and be more responsive to the students and their parents?
Thank you. And I have one question from the chat. Sri Lanka is having a more vibrant non-state university education except the medical stream. That's a question from Professor Manjula Gamage. So with that, I like to probably start with Professor Biswajit. These are the last 10 minutes. If you can take 3 minutes and sort of answer some of these questions, answer these questions and give your own final remarks, please. Professor Biswajit. Biswajit said he has to go, so I might then go to Professor Norton, please.
Yeah, so on the question of funding for quality, we don't actually have any specific funding for quality of teaching. We do in research, where there's a complex performance scheme for funding research, but there is a lot of regulation, particularly of courses leading to occupation. So there are about 100 different accrediting agencies which interact with Australian universities. And there is a quality regulator which doesn't actually look in detail at improving quality, it's just about minimum standards. There's also a survey done of current students every year, and the results are published. And some of Australia's most prestigious universities tend to do quite badly in these surveys, but it doesn't really have an impact on their standing or their student numbers. So even though it's interesting to see that these numbers are as they are, it doesn't necessarily seem to prompt huge improvements in the behaviour of the institutions, because a number of them have had several continuous years of being down the bottom of the list. Thanks, Chanda.
Yes, but I have a question that comes from actually Sujiva's question as well. He was talking about how do we get people to choose better courses. And in Sri Lanka, I think we have the system where the policymakers decide these are the better courses and we offer them. I don't think you did that, presented that here, but Australia has a way of manipulating the demand for different courses by setting different pricing for. Could you just say something about that, since we have a bit of time and Professor Sujata is not here?
The previous government did introduce this in Australia. It doesn't work.
Okay.
Partway through a paper on this, all the trends are just continuing trends that was there beforehand. And the reason is students choose courses based on their interests. They're not going to choose a different course that I'm interested in for, say, a few $1,000s. It just doesn't make sense in theory. And to the extent they are worried about the money, whether you're going to get a job at the end or the salary of the job you're going to get at the end is far more important than whether a course is a few $1,000s cheaper or more expensive in a given year. So in my view, if you want to persuade people to do different courses, you have to work on persuasion. So these are the courses that are interesting. These are the courses that are going to lead to a good job at the other end. That is going to work in a way that I think price incentives will not.
But a medical degree would cost a lot more and they'll have to pay a lot more. So that way the loans are set. No, the fees are set differently for different subjects by the universities, or are they set by the government?
Set by the government. And medicine is the only course in Australia where the government actually has a hard cap on the numbers. And that has made them extremely competitive. So only about 20% of people who apply for medicine actually get in. I think it's kind of similar in other countries as well. This is the most competitive course. There's never any problem with demand, but the government has this. Essentially, the government believes that if you create more doctors, they will, order unnecessary tests and consultations, and increase the cost of the public health system. Whether this is true or not, I don't know, but that has been a policy in Australia for a very long time.
So they set a cap on how many doctors are produced, how many MBBS graduates are produced.
That's right, yes. And
Could I
universities can
ask-
specialize.
Could I ask a follow-up question from my question?
Yeah, we have time, yes.
Yeah, my follow-up question is to Professor Norton. this goes back to my original question about, how much money comes from the government to the universities. If, for example, University A sees decreased demand and decreased enrollments due to demographic or whatever, unpopularity, for some reason, and University B sees increased enrollments, does that, what are the financial implications for the two universities? Or are they not very sensitive to increased or decreased enrollments? And again, it's connected to my competition question. Do they have to compete to bring students in, or can they just go about their business?
So they do have to compete to a degree under the current system, but effectively what happens was if they so-called under-enroll, that is they take fewer students than their funding allocation supports, they simply just don't get the money for the students they haven't enrolled. But for the university that takes more students, if they take more students than their original funding allocation, they can get the student component of their revenue, but they can't get the government component. And so that is a break on kind of moving resources around the system. Until 2017, or during 2012 to 2017, we had something called the demand-driven system, where resources could just follow demand wherever it went around the system, which is my preferred system. But now we've got this problem where essentially what can happen is resources are allocated to one university, they can't use them, but their competitor can't use the resources either. And so basically the system delivers fewer students than it's theoretically capable of funding. And so there's basically wastage in the system. So this is something I want to have fixed in sort of the latest policy review.
You're advocating a demand-driven system where the universities can.
Yes. So which does have problems in the sense that the cost to government is less predictable. And probably we did overshoot a bit in the demand-driven system, which is too many graduates. But I think for increasing participation and efficiently moving between resources between universities and between disciplines according to where the system is going, I think it's outperformed anything we've had before in Australia or since.
So I have last 5 minutes, Professor Sampath. I'd like to please give your final remarks. I'd like to give an example. We have a technology stream introduced, and I think the employment rate is low for that. Maybe we need to give it more time. But I mean, don't we need some way to modulate this demand and supply, just rather than giving it free? And also people are leaving the country. We have medical doctors just leaving the country soon after their internship. I mean, is the government, aren't you thinking of proposing some sort of payback system, for at least beginning with medical degrees, and also everybody pay even some small amount so that there's more accountability? Would that be considered, in your opinion, Professor Sampath? Anyway, it's your final remarks.
Yes, we are concerned about this. And we are now actually started preparing cost of each and every graduates in different areas. We have already calculated recurrent expenditure. So we have data information, but we have not so far included the capital expenditure on different areas. So we are doing the calculation, and we are actually going to propose to the government, because we are spending such a huge amount of money to produce graduates. At least the cost of graduates, at least at the time they leave the nation, and if they quit soon after the graduation, otherwise we don't mind if they at least work for 5-10 years. So government is now have concerns about that. And also I want to mention a very important point here. When it is come to university entrance, we don't have interviews. We have only the Z-score value. We don't know actually who is going to come. And when it is come to employability, if you have an interview, this is the practice all over the world. Without having a proper interview, no one will recruit or no one will give a placement in a university. But in Sri Lanka, we do this. And that is one area where we have this unemployability in arts especially. So we believe actually with the double degree program, introducing IT and computer, we will be able to solve the issue to some extent.
Thank you so much, Professor Amaratunge, for staying on. I know you had to go from meeting to meeting, but thank you for staying on. And Professor Norton, thank you for giving us your time. And for all the participants, and Professor Biswajit is not here. I think there's a lot to digest. This video will be available very quickly. We'll let you know as soon as it's available within a day or two. And there's a lot to digest. There's a lot of information. We will take those into account, and it's heartening to hear some of the new initiatives about having interviews for, rather than just going by, marks gained in 3 papers for one, in a 3-hour paper. So that's really good to hear. And that there's going to be more competitive elements introduced in the system, make it more efficient and effective. Thank you all. And I think we start on time, we end on time, and we don't try to not waste people's time. So I hope this has been a productive session. Thank you all, and good evening. We conclude the seminar.